25 years ago, the greatest games console and the most influential games console nobody bought came out, the SEGA Dreamcast. Unable to find an audience back then, the console has rightly been regarded as a product ahead of its time and a fitting swan song for SEGA as a console maker. To tell stories from its launch and to discuss its incredible legacy, please welcome the founders of the DC UK magazine from the time, Casper Field and Keith Stewart, and the member of the Dreamcast Junkyard team, plus author of the Dreamcast Year 1 and 2 books, Andrew Dickinson. Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming to EGX MCM.
Thanks for having us.
Now,
Thank you.
Casper, I might start with you. Keith, you can join in. When all of you really, when did you first encounter the SEGA Dreamcast, and what were your first impressions?
So my first contact with Dreamcast was, I was working at Edge magazine in like 98, I guess. And Edge famously had fallen out with Sega, or Sega fallen out with Edge, before my time there.
What did you do?
Well, I think Edge got blamed for the death of Sam, right? I mean, you were there, right?
I was there. This is going to be a theme of the entire thing.
Yeah.
Because I often got in trouble with Sega. It's very much a love-hate relationship in that I love them and they hate me. But yeah, basically we were so excited about PlayStation. It was such a big deal. And when Jason Brooks, the editor of Edge, took over, PlayStation was coming out, so that got a lot more, I think, coverage in Edge in that period than the Saturn should have done. And the Saturn was is a better console, obviously. So,
all that happened, and then Tony Mott, who was the editor then, said to me, like Sega hate us, but apparently they're doing a new thing and they're going to announce it in Japan, and it might be all right. Don't know, it might be pump. But do you want to go? And I was like, well, all right. And so I went, and that was my first contact, which I flew out to Tokyo. I went to the announcement of the Neo Otani Hotel, and I got my props, so I brought some stuff to show people. And my first prop was my coolest, I think, which is that everyone who went to the Neo Otani for the Dreamcast announcement got a free Dreamcast laser pointer. So
I don't understand, what was the association with laser pointers and Dreamcast?
I think it was something to do with the future. I don't know. I think laser pointers were kind of big in the 90s, so
okay,
we all got one. So yeah, it was.
Oh wow!
I know it was.
How much did you get on that eBay for that?
I don't know. I want to keep it. I was saying to my son on the way up here, like I sold a lot of my old game stuff, but my Dreamcast laser pointer is kind of.
Well, and so is it because of the laser pointer that you were won over by the?
That was basically it. Yeah, I got a laser pointer. I thought, right, let's launch a magazine. So so from that, I came back and you've got questions. We're going to talk about the covers of Edge and things later, but
well, I'll come back. I'll come back to you to talk about what you did after you saw it. Keith, when did you first discover the Dreamcast?
Well, I was on Edge magazine when we started getting rumours from Tokyo about a project that was in development called Dural at the time, and the rumours that it was really weird. Sega had a really difficult, weird approach to console development, and that they'd often have like one or two different teams working on like the same generation of technology at once, but very different teams in different places. And the rumour was at the time that Sega, because the Saturn hadn't done well, they were kind of looking outside of Sega's own A&R department, research and development department for technology to make the next console. So I think they were in talks with like IBM. So they had this very early idea for a console called Dural, which was based on kind of some off-the-shelf components, a lot cheaper to produce than the Saturn. The Saturn had a lot of proprietary technology in it, lots of graphics chipsets, very complex to work for, very complex to produce. So their whole idea with Dreamcast was to produce something cheaper. And so I was getting all of these rumours when I was on Edge. And so I kind of found out about it very early, and it was extremely exciting to me being a Sega fanboy. But it was all shrouded in secrecy, and they weren't really telling us much about it because they didn't really trust us. So
when you finally did get to see it, did get to experience it, was it everything you dreamed of?
No, the first time actually was when you showed it to me, when you asked me to be on the magazine, and I'd not seen a working Dreamcast until you'd got an import from somewhere, I think.
think I got a Japanese one.
Yeah. And that was and I think we were probably playing. Was it Sega Rally? I can't remember.
Sega, maybe. Well, I think I remember in the early days I got Virtua Fighter.
Oh yeah, it was Virtua Fighter.
Sega Rally, and Sonic. I think I got those three.
Yeah, and I mean, it was incredible. Like the graphical the upscale from what I was used to, and the Sega was outputting in. I think it was like. What was it? What was the screen resolution? It was really high. It was higher than PS2.
And you'll know, right?
The screen resolution. Oh goodness, you put me on the spot. You probably got it written down in your pad. I think it was. I know it was 480p, I believe.
Yeah.
I
think so.
Yeah, 64480.
Yeah.
So
it was brand new. It was incredible.
What about you, Andrew? When did you first Dreamcast discovered?
I'm gonna be really mean and make these guys feel old because I was 16 when I got my first Dreamcast.
So was I.
Yeah, just made these two feel really old. And I got it as a birthday present for my 16th birthday. I had no love for Sega whatsoever before the Dreamcast. I was a PlayStation guy, and before that I had a NES and a SNES. And the only reason I got a Dreamcast was to play Resident Evil Code Veronica.
Oh my
God. That was literally the only reason I got one. But as soon as I got it, my mum bought it for my birthday a few months in advance, and I kept persuading her to get it out every so often so I could test it. And I got a copy of Power Stone and Crazy Taxi with it, and I just played those for hours, and I just fell in love with it completely. It was unlike anything I'd ever played before. So yeah.
I have quite a similar story. I was a Nintendo boy, not a PlayStation boy. But if you remember the end of the N64's life cycle, nothing came out. And I was waiting for the GameCube, and the Dreamcast had been discontinued, and I could pick it up for £20 from my local warehouse store. And my choices, which was a rental store back in the day, they were doing all of their Dreamcast games X rental. So I bought a Dreamcast for 20 quid, and I was buying Shenmue for £6 and Shenmue 2 for £6. But the reason why I wanted the Dreamcast, because I wasn't a Sega boy, was for Code Veronica, because I was a massive Resident Evil fan. So, but I fell in love with it. Like, everything about it, I'd never played anything like it before, since really. And it was an amazing games console. But it's not about me. Casper, you were going to tell us a story. So you'd gone to see it, right? You came back and you proclaimed Sega dead.
yeah, I kind of did. Kind of actually. Well, so went to Tokyo, saw the console, and like you guys are saying, I saw it and I just kind of loved the idea of it, and I really loved the name of it. You know, like particularly, I still think it's one of the best product names. You know, like in an industry that's full of things like Xbox, super imaginative. You know, the concept that you had a console called the Dreamcast that was about conveying dreams to people and these magical experiences, I thought had a lovely ambition to it. But in Tokyo, at the announce, the original console hardware only had the Dreamcast logo, because Sega felt like their brand at the time, they were genuinely worried it had been so tainted by Saturn that they were going to maybe launch Dreamcast as just Dreamcast. Anyway, so I came back to the bath and we were working on the cover of the magazine, and this lovely orange cover, and we were working on the cover lines, and I thought, well, let's riff on this a bit. So the cover was, Sega is dead, long live Dreamcast. But I think at the time, Edge was still coming in a plastic bag.
Yeah, it was.
It would have been, yeah. So the Sega PR guys got their copies in the office, tore them open and slid it out of the bag, and the first thing they see as they slide the bag out is Sega is dead in big black letters. And they just and apparently they had a total heart attack until they pulled the rest of it out and realised what else had said. Well,
Probably took some explaining. So you talked about it. Was Sega, do you think their brand was damaged at that point?
you might remember better than me.
Yeah, I mean, it was really tricky. So, like I was saying before, how Sega had this weird way of working that sometimes Sega Japan be working on a product and Sega America would be working on a product, and they'd have third parties working on products as well, because they had IBM involved in the Dreamcast early on. And so in between, after the Mega Drive, they had the Mega CD came out, and then the 32X came out, And then there were all of these like riffs on those. So there was a Sega Jupiter in planning, there was a Sega Neptune in planning, and they completely diluted their market and their fan base. And people would just get really annoyed at these things coming out. And so when Sega Saturn came out, the hardware was this kind of very confusing, very difficult for developers. So it was kind of felt like they'd basically almost destroyed or alienated their fan base a little bit, but also the industry hugely, and especially the retail industry as well, were really annoyed with Sega because they kept bringing out all these products that no one was buying. So they diluted their marketplace, and I think so when Dreamcast came out, it was going up against a PlayStation which had established this enormous publicity and huge sales, and everybody was as soon as Dreamcast came out, people were looking at PS2. So I think they'd kind of muddied the market for themselves with all these multiple machines and these confusing array, which was really difficult for me as a Sega fan, trying to write about them and trying to say, look, hold on everyone, Dreamcast is going to be great.
Actually, I think it was E3 '99. I was flying to the States. I was at Passport Control in America, and the guy was like, "Oh, why are you here? What are you here to talk? What are you here to do?" I was like, "Oh, I'm a writer. I write about video games." And he was like, "Oh, right, okay. You're here for the show." I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Oh, okay, man. What'd you cover?" I was like, "Well, I'm really interested in this new Sega machine." He was like, "Sega, those guys? What? I have one of those Saturns, man. That thing was a piece of shit. Like, oh my god." And I was like, "All right. Well, I make it." But yeah, he was like, I thought he was going to not let me into America because but it was interesting in terms of like the public perception of it all. Like even the Passport Control guy was pissed off with doing that.
I've had a couple of interviews with people down the years. Tom Kalinske tells a story about how the Sega Saturn, one point PlayStation, after PlayStation got shunned by Nintendo, they went to Tom Kalinske and said, "Hey, could we make your next console for you? You do the console, you make the games." And Tom was like, "Yeah, let's make that happen." But Japan was like, "No." And he talks about that a little bit. But I also remember that time, Peter Moore. So I actually spoke to Peter Moore for this. So he's given me a bit of insight. But one of the things he said that he was quite naive. He'd come from Reebok. He wasn't a games person. And he comes in and he sees PlayStation 2 showing like this incredible trailer for like The Bounce or whatever it is, which is all CGI. It was all smoke and mirrors. And he was like, "How are they making games look that good?" He was really naive about it. And he talked about how they fudded Sega at the time, which is fear, uncertainty, doubt, make you think the console is inferior, make you think you're missing out on the whole thing. And it was a very effective, and there was a bit of naivety, I think, in Sega trying to go up against it. Andrew, you've spoken to so many people about the Dreamcast. How do you see it?
I mean, I think the problem that Sega had going into it is that they didn't have enough money as the starting point, realistically. I mean, you can talk about PlayStation 2, the spectre of it looming. Of course, that was a big deal, and that had a part to play. But Sega were on the verge of bankruptcy, and the only reason that they were able to not be bankrupt was to kind of go into third party and for their director to essentially forgive all the debt that they had. So they had no money for advertising per se. They tried. Apparently about 3/4 of it went on the Arsenal shirts and the football shirts. So, which I don't know how much that did in terms of marketing and branding.
Sold to all the Arsenal fans.
Do you remember they did I think it was like 2 weeks before Virtua Tennis came out, they did a massive football-themed event in London, even though they had no football game, because they'd spent so much money on football sponsorship, they had to justify it.
Yeah.
And so I think they built a beach football
They
thing
did.
in London.
Yeah, I went to it. Yeah.
Did you go to that?
Yeah, and I met Terry Venables when I was there. Yeah, it was a very strange event, but it was very Sega, and it felt like half organised and a bit chaotic. Whereas everything that PlayStation were doing at that time was so glossy and manufactured and full of superstars. And here was Sega running this beach football event in London with Tanner Venables sitting in the corner with Chris Evans drinking. And it just had this really weird air of incompleteness about it, which is why I still love Sega. But it was a very strange event. Yeah. But they spent, I think it was like a third of their advertising budget, and they sponsored Arsenal, Sampdoria, and St Etienne. For 2 years. And
that was all down to JF, wasn't it? JF Sicilian.
Yeah, the Sega Europe CEO. Yeah.
Just a mad football fan, so he just got to spend all their money on football clubs.
But didn't get a football game.
No.
Okay. Well, let's talk about DC UK. which was, it sounds like a Saturday morning kids. But anyway, it was initially pitched as the official Dreamcast magazine, was that right?
Yeah, that's right. DC UK started as featured pitching to do the official Dreamcast, and so that happened. But at the time, Future's big earner was the official PlayStation magazine, which was, in those days, it was like 500,000 copies a month still, I think. Right? Like that's
So at that time they were going up and down depending on how good the demo disc was, but between 250 and 600,000 copies. So the only magazine in the UK that was selling more than the official PlayStation magazine was the Radio Times. Which dates us all, really.
Yeah. So Future was loving it, right? And then I think it was maybe a sign of people in the industry thought Dreamcast had legs in the early days of it, and were interested in what it was going to do. And I wasn't part of those business conversations, but apparently, Sony wasn't keen on the idea of Sega having an official magazine in the same publishing house as them. So.
Yeah, Sony were quite. Chris Deering was on this stage yesterday. He was the European president of PlayStation, and he was saying even though they were confident going into PS2, they were not. They were terrified of Xbox. They were terrified of Dreamcast. They're like, no, don't give them an inch. Don't give them an inch. Now, don't let them do the official magazine with that lot. Don't. That was. He didn't say that, but I'm imagining that's part of that very aggressive Sony.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of. I think they were going off the back of the fact that generationally there was a lot of interchange in the industry, wasn't there? It was very rare for one console manufacturer to dominate for 2 generations in a row.
He said that.
So in Nintendo with the NES, they were so super confident about going into the SNES era, and it did brilliantly in Japan, but Mega Drive destroyed it in the US. It did much better. In the UK and Europe, Sega Master System was huge. So there was no incidents really of someone just winning twice easily, and I think Sony, to their credit, didn't take anything for granted.
Wouldn't let you do the official magazine. Now you were editor for a bit, but you then took over. Is that right? After the
Yeah. So I got into it because we did a special supplement on Edge. So Edge used to do these hardware specials that are like a big square add-on to the magazine, and then we did one on Dreamcast. We would have rolled a breakdown of the hardware and interviewed the hardware designer, who interestingly said that he was really 50-50 about whether to put a modem in it or whether to put a DVD player. And they were really on the fence about which way to go with it. And I always wondered if it had a DVD player in it. Although the modem and the online stuff was really exciting and they did some interesting stuff, it was very early for online play. And I always wondered, I think people have talked about this ever since, if it had... For how popular PlayStation 2 was because of its DVD playback feature, if Dreamcast had that as well, it might have been a bit more of an even battle. I don't know. So I did that, and then we were working on the pitch. So it started off with just me sitting in a corner with loads of magazine pages torn out of all sorts of things like Car Magazine and bits of USA Today and all sorts of stuff stuck on the wall. And that was worked up into becoming the pitch for the official Dreamcast.
Were there any particular memorable Dreamcast? You mentioned a few already. Any other, particularly Terry Venables, any other memorable Dreamcast press events and trips or game trips?
We managed to do some of our own, I think. To DC UK, especially in the early days, we were trying to do some of the stuff that Arcade Magazine had done as well, of trying to be a bit more lifestyle, picking up on cues of things like Loaded had done. And so we kind of went off on our own adventures, and including one based on Sega Bass Fishing, which I think you should tell the story about.
Yeah, so this was a really good time for magazine publishing, and there was a lot of money in magazine publishing. An official PlayStation magazine had brought a lot of money into Future, so we had quite big budgets to do silly things. And one of the things we decided to do was when Sega Bass Fishing came out, we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we hired a fishing boat and actually went out and tried to catch some bass ourselves as an interesting take on this game?
So super relevant to the game, wasn't it?
I know. It's very professional. So I got on the phone and managed to hire a small fishing boat in Padstow in Cornwall, and
but it was like November or something, wasn't it?
It was November, and this guy couldn't believe his luck, I think. And he turned out to be. We got down to Padstow. We got there the night before. Had quite a crazy night in the hotel, which we got banned from. And woke up in the morning hungover, and we arranged to meet this guy at 7 o'clock in the morning at Padstow Harbour. And
you're saying hungover and a crazy night.
I mean, we could put some flesh on the bones there, right? Because you're a bit hungover, or like a lot hungover.
We were really hungover, and so we got on this boat, and it was this tiny fishing boat, and the guy looked like Quint from Jaws. He had this kind of really dirty overalls on, and he had this guy who was working with him who never said anything and was just labouring away in the background. So he took us out onto the sea, and for the first hour it was fine. We caught a few mackerels to use as bait, and then we all started feeling really sick. And I think it was Stephen Lawson, the journalist who was with me. I had basically me and Esther, who was the deputy editor, and Stephen Lawson, and our photographer, Nick. And I think Nick was the first one to start throwing up. And he had all this expensive camera equipment, and he was throwing up over the sides, and then Stephen started, and then Esther started, and it was an absolute disaster. But we got a good feature out of it. We got amazing photographs, and we also got a lot of pollock. We didn't catch any bass, but we caught some pollock. And he did. This guy, Quinn, was dissecting the fish on the ship, on the boat, which in high seas with this gigantic knife, and that made us feel even worse.
Yeah. I think Nick got a picture of you and Esther and Stephen all throwing up over the side of the boat simultaneously.
I didn't actually throw up. Me and Esther were in a standoff. It was like that scene in Bridesmaids when they're all trying not to vomit first, and it was like that, but on the sea. And but then that got passed, and we did it, and it was a good 6-page feature.
It was, yeah.
Nothing about the game, but
no, very little about the game.
So is that it wasn't even a presser trip, it was your own.
We just made our own press trip. Yeah. I mean, press trips were really good back then. You know, there were all sorts of good adventures, but
yeah, I mean, going to we both got to go to the Tokyo Game Show. I think you went in 1999, and I went in 2000.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And that was amazing, and because I knew Sega's magazine in the US, I know the editor Simon Cox. I got to go on their press trip, so I got to go and see Sega in Tokyo in 2000. And I met the Skies of Arcadia team, I met the Fantasy Star Online team, and it was just incredible to be inside Tokyo Sega HQ in Tokyo and meet these people and talk to them. I couldn't believe my luck.
So what I do remember from Sega HQ in Tokyo is that on the executive floor, on the top level, was all glass walls, and in the middle of it, they had a smoking room. And so they had this glass box in the middle of the executive floor that was literally like a room full of fog. And just everyone would go in there and smoke Marlboro Red furiously and then come back out and have meetings. Super weird. And it was just like a smoky cube.
Sounds very Sega.
Yeah.
Keith, while on DC UK, I believe you were, my voice is going, I believe you were blacklisted, is that right, from Sega?
Yeah, I was. I was blacklisted by Sega. And what happened was, we weren't flavoured. So basically, this was the mid-2000s, and we already knew as a magazine that Dreamcast was in trouble. And we also understood that the people that were buying our magazine were really hardcore gamers who were really interested in the import scene. And a lot of the really good Sega Dreamcast magazines were coming out in Japan first. They were coming back with better screen resolution, they were designed to be played on 60 hertz televisions rather than 50 hertz televisions, so they were better versions. So we knew we had this big import community in the UK that wanted to know about Japanese games. So I'd actually run a feature a month before on how to do what was used to be called the disc swap trick. So you could swap discs on the Sega in order to play on your Dreamcast in order to play import games. And I'd run a feature on this. The Sega were very unhappy. So the next month, I got a call from a company called Daytel that made cheap cartridges.
Action replays?
Yeah, it's called, they made it Action Replay. They made cartridges for the Mega Drive, Nintendo, but they had a cheap disc they were marketing for the Dreamcast. And you put this disc into your Dreamcast, and then it would allow you to input cheats for certain games. Then when you played those games, the cheats would run. And they offered me the chance to have a demo version of their disc on my front cover, which would have cheats for 4 or 5 of the top games. So having a cover disc was really important in the late 90s. That's how you sold video game magazines. You had anything on the cover, that would sell your issue. And they said, we'll put it on your cover free, we'll put it on every single issue, and your readers will have this cheat disc. So I said, yeah, fine, let's do it. we did the deal. The magazines hit the shelves in the shops, and I was on the Sega forums, as I always was, and I started seeing lots of posts about this copy of DC UK, which was giving away this disc on the front cover that overrode the security protocol of the Dreamcast, so that you could put this disc in and it would allow you to run in-port games. And also, I believe, with a little bit of jiggery-pokery, you could also run CDRs as well. So like I went through it was like the 7 stages of grief, but it was the 7 stages of panic. And I was thinking, oh my God, when Sega sees this, I'm dead. But then my second thought was, I rang our distributor to make sure there were enough copies going out to meet demand, because I knew, obviously, it was going to sell amazingly well. So, but yeah, about an hour later, I got a call from Sega's PR person, who I got on really well with, and he was just saying, I'm sorry, this is it for us. We can't help you with anything. We can't send you games. You're finished for us. And I was like, okay.
Was that Mark? Was it still Mark there?
No, it wasn't Mark then. It was someone, I can't remember who it was, but they were very apologetic. But so yeah, I then had, this was like in issue 11. So I had a long time with no Sega support whatsoever.
So you had a Sega magazine, without
no
any
Sega
support, right?
So yeah, that was fun, and I had a very, very interesting, lively discussion with my publisher. It was Jackie, I think it was.
Okay.
Actually, it was Chris Power by then. So yeah.
I do want to show a slide if I can get it up on the screen, if that's possible. So here it is the UK. The top 30, we can see it right down there as well if you can squint. Top 30 best-selling Dreamcast games. Anything in here surprise any of you?
I'm heartbroken that Power Stone is number 19. That was like, we put it on cover of issue 2, I think.
Yeah.
Power Stone was just such a fantastic game. If you never played it, it's like a third-person fighting game, and you could tear bits of things off and hit each other with them. And I think it's coming out, isn't it, Andrew, on a...
Yeah, there's a Capcom fighting compilation that's coming out like next year with Power Stone 1 and 2 and Project Justice as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so yeah, that's like 19th.
I know. It was such a great. I have to say one last thing about Power Stone was I actually got to, when I went to Tokyo to see Tokyo Game Show, I also got a trip to Osaka on the bullet train to see Capcom. And I was one of the first Western journalists to be invited onto the game development floor at Capcom. And I loved the game Power Stone. I got to meet the team making Power Stone 2. And I was so overcome with emotion that I was like sitting there and they were showing me the game and I was like teary-eyed because I couldn't believe I was there. And about 15 years later, I wrote a feature on Power Stone and they remembered me. And they agreed to do an interview with me about the Power Stone era because they'd remembered that I sat there and cried. And I was looking at that game and it was so incredible. It was such an incredible experience. So yeah, Power Stone was wonderful.
I'm a bit surprised I'm not surprised Jet Set Radio is low because I guess it's a very Japan game. I was a bit surprised Dead or Alive 2 was down there.
Jet Set Radio being so low is interesting because it's such an influential game. Such as like the cel-shaded graphics obviously kicked off a whole aesthetic in the industry that carries on.
I think that's true of the Dreamcast as a whole, right? It was such an influential console, as I say, that nobody bought. Anything in there, Andrew, that's...
I mean, I'm surprised that something like Hidden and Dangerous has managed to get into that list. It's interesting. But it's interesting to see something like Tomb Raider 4 getting quite high up, but that I guess will be because they had such a big deal with IDOS to kind of like had Lara Croft holding Dreamcast consoles and stuff, so I guess that's why.
There's quite a few IDOS games in there, actually. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire at number 20 is the record holder for the most UK number ones any game has ever had. If you want to, that number 2 is Zumba Fitness on Wii. If you want to,
I worked at IDOS for a while in the early 2000s, and the producer of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire had all these amazing outtakes from Chris Tarrant when he was doing the Brio recording, talking about what a sexy devil he was, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Andrew, anything else that you think the movie?
Of course.
Here as well.
It's right in front of us. Yeah. I mean, the top ones aren't a surprise whatsoever. Like Crazy Taxi sold just over 1 million copies, so it's kind of not a surprise to see that there at all. I'm quite surprised Sega Rally 2 did so well, but I suppose that was a launch title, so it's not quite as fondly as something like the original Sega Rally.
Metropolis Street Racer, which obviously became Project Gotham on Xbox.
Yeah, I mean, you told me a story about you covering Metropolis Street Racer, right? When you hired a car in London.
Oh yeah.
That was another one of our ridiculous budget things, wasn't it? Like we had a.
Well, actually, because MSR was coming out, and I was like, well, I wonder if we could borrow a car and try and recreate this, because it was all about driving around realistic bits of London.
And they'd accurately modelled the London streets, hadn't they, as well, for the game?
That's right. So I rang up Mazda. I rang up Nissan and tried to get a Nissan Skyline. They said no. And then I rang up Mazda and said, oh, could you lend us an MX-5, because that's in the game. And the woman just went, yeah, fine. So, like, literally, like a week later, this nice dude turns up at this house that I was renting in London. He goes, here you go, mate, I'll be back in a week, there's keys. I was like, do you need to see any ID or anything? He was like, no, it'll be fine. I was like, what about insurance? He's like, no, we've got that, that's fine. I was like, okay. So then, me and the photographer Jude spent like a week just driving this MX-5 around London very responsibly. And
didn't you parked in Trafalgar Square, didn't you? There's a photograph of you parked in Trafalgar Square.
We did do that, yeah, because we were like, okay, because at the time you could go around all of Trafalgar Square. Now it's pedestrianised on the north side. But it was, and in the game you could do laps of it. So obviously we were trying to do laps and possibly drifting a little bit on the corners and stuff. And they were like, well, let's get a photo of it by Nelson's Column. So I just reversed it up into the middle of Trafalgar Square.
Wow.
And we took like a handful of photos, and then about 10 policemen turned up. It touched to move on.
Trickstar was on that list. That was the Alex Ward before Burnout game as well, wasn't it? It's gone now. The list has gone. But yeah, that was another one.
No, there was no Capcom Street Fighter games on there, is there? And I think like one of my two of my favourite games are Capcom vs SNK and Street Fighter Marvel Superheroes 2. They were amazing on Dreamcast.
This is the UK, I think it's worth stressing.
Yeah,
it's not global.
but still, come on, UK.
I thought Trickstar was great. I mean, we put that on the very first cover instead of Sonic, because we kind of wanted to celebrate like original games for the console. Because there was, especially because like obviously they did Sonic, but there was an awful lot of stuff that had come from the Naomi hardware that was arcadey. So it was really cool to see like a British developed game, new IP. Original concept. Trickstar was like hoverboarding, right? So, like, it felt like something to celebrate. A really nicely made game.
It made the magazine stand out, didn't it? Because like there was 4 Dreamcast magazines at the time. Fisher Dreamcast magazine from Paragon, I think it was, and another one and ours, and all the rest of them was like Sonic, Trick style. I mean, it was commercial suicide, but
Actually, that reminds me. Actually,
Got some more props.
What helped was, and this really dates it, we put DC UK issue 1 had a free videotape.
Yeah.
With loads of clips of the games on.
What was on there? What was on? What did they got? Sonic.
But this was not even open. It's still sellotaped. It's got Sonic Adventure,
Soul Calibur.
Yeah, Soul Calibur.
UEFA Striker, ready to
Power
rumble.
Stone. Yeah.
Oh wow. Andrew, what do you think were the defining games of the Dreamcast?
So can you
What were the defining games of the Dreamcast to you?
Defining it. I mean, the top one is Shenmue, right? Like Shenmue is absolutely defining. It has kind of shaped games going forward. So I think a lot of games now are a debt to Shenmue, or Shenmue, or however you pronounce it. Loads of people pronounce it differently. But then you've got, I mean, everything that's at the top there. Realistically, Soul Calibur is basically an arcade perfect port, and in fact it does better than the arcade. I've played it in the arcade. It's not as good as the Dreamcast version, oddly, which is the first time that I think the console was ever capable of doing that. The Dreamcast was the first console that could do console perfect or better than, arcade perfect or better than arcade games. But yeah, I think things like that, Crazy Taxi, it's the quirkiness of Sega and the joy that they brought. It's the whole blue sky aesthetic that they had. So anything like that, like Crazy Taxi, like Jet Set Radio.
Yeah, like those games like Jet Set Radio, Space Channel 5, Choo Choo Rocket, they had such like an aesthetic vision that was so different from the rest of the industry. And it was really fed, I think, by the fact that they had a lot of really young game designers that were really into Tokyo nightlife at the time. So people like Tetsuya Mizuguchi, who made Res and Space Channel 5. And he was really into clubbing and really into like the Tokyo street scene, street culture, street fashion. And they brought all this into their games, and it was so exuberant. And their knowledge of street fashion, Tokyo like fashion gangs on the streets, from like the kind of schoolgirl fashion gangs to like neo-punks, and all of this fed into like those games, and it was like nothing else.
Yeah, it was really interesting as well that because Sega was in the position it was, there was almost like, well, you don't really care anymore, we're just going to do whatever we want. And that's why you got Sega Gaga, which is like an incredible game, never came out here but was in Japan, which basically took the mickey out of Sega and all the other console makers, and you just would not have got that with any other company but Sega at the time of Dreamcast. It was just such an incredible and creative time for gaming.
And it's also overlooked a little bit how the fact that the Dreamcast was the first first games console to market with a modem built in, and I think it was a 33 board, 33K in Japan, but 56 here, wasn't it? I think
It might be the other way around, I think.
Oh, really?
Maybe.
I think America got a 56.
Yeah,
I think America got a 56, we got a 33.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But it's very difficult to communicate if you weren't there at the time. How amazing that was to have a console that was like properly online and everyone could get on, and there was an online service.
Yeah, to give it some context, so I was one of the first people I knew to get an email address, and I was part of a special initiative when I lived in Manchester to get creative people online, and they got a load of us together, about 200-300 people from around Manchester, and gave everyone a modem, and I got an email address, and that was 1995. So to release a console 4 years later, like, that had a modem built in, was really so forward thinking.
Yeah.
And of course they did that amazing Malcolm McLaren advert with the we all play games.
I am somewhat conscious of the time. I've just looked at it. I'm suddenly surprised that this has gone really quick. I love this. Very quickly, when did you start feeling, okay, this isn't working out, Dreamcast isn't going to last? When did you first get that feeling? I guess.
Well, quite soon after the US launch, I think. Like, the US launch did really well, and that was in 9/9/99. And I think we'd always kind of knew we were going to be an underdog, didn't we? Like, we knew in the magazine that Dreamcast was an underdog. But I think it was after the Sega launch in the US where they had this amazing first week, and then it nosedived. And then the other massive thing was finding out Electronic Arts weren't going to support the console. FIFA and Madden was so important in the console world at that point in terms of like mainstream gamers, and to not have Electronic Arts on board, that was a death blow, I think.
I laughed because for me it kind of coincided, or felt just, it sort of landed. So I did DC UK and then left after 6.5 issues, I think, because someone offered me loads of money to go to London and start a kids' Dreamcast magazine called Mr. Dreamcast.
You brought it up.
And but they doubled my salary basically with feature publishing. And my girlfriend at the time was in London. I love London. Anyway, so I went, and then it was about after quitting and getting there, was sort of in that window was where it started to really dawn on me that this Dreamcast thing was maybe not gonna.
I knew by then, because like Casper tried to get me to come on the magazine with him. And he said, we're going to go and live in London, and we're going to launch a kids' Dreamcast magazine called Mr. Dreamcast. I thought we were having some kind of breakdown.
I did afterwards.
Well, let's end with this then. What do you think is Dreamcast's legacy?
For me personally, is that I did Mr. Dreamcast, and then tumbled out of games journalism and went into game production, which I've been doing for the last 24 years. So it changed my life in an unexpected.
So one of the greatest game developers of our time is formed by the... I love your game. You love the games you've made. It's great.
Huh?
Yeah, I love the games you've made. So that's, that's an influence.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Yeah, but yeah...
it's a bit of a big head thing to say the legacy is me.
That's but I think in the industry, we've been talking about it, like I think the game, for me, again, going right back to the start, like the ambition of the thing and this casting of dreams, like trying to be something creative and interesting was really important. I think that it also, like, Sega realised something that Nintendo still don't know if they've fully realised, that the importance of supporting third parties and working with, and having to look beyond, as a publisher and as a console format holder, what Sony had done, which was look beyond your four walls and to reach out to the world. I think in terms of the hardware, like we were talking about just now, like the hardware itself was one of the first to start using off-the-shelf components, which now pretty much they all do in their own way,
Yeah.
So a lot of things changed off the back of it.
Yeah. I think as well, like with the Dreamcast games, I think Sega were the first console manufacturer to really think outside the video game space and look at wider culture. And I don't mean having flashy photo shoots in the adverts. What I mean is, if you look at games like Jet Set Radio, which really celebrate graffiti culture, Shenmue, which gave you control over the lead character's life as he just wandered the streets, eating noodles, playing retro video games, looking for sailors at the docks, things we've all done and we can all relate to. And it really, and also it created this sense that games could be an open world. Metropolis Streetwear, Shenmue, there were other open world games around at the time, but these really kind of broadened it out and created these really interesting cultural moments that I don't think games had ever done before.
I mean, I'd say that its legacy now is the creativity in the community, because it was a console that was so creative in the output that it had, and that's continued to today, because unwittingly, things like your disc that you put on the cover allowed people to then play import games, but also any game they wanted that could be put on the Dreamcast, which, now we have modded Dreamcasts. People could play indie games on their Dreamcast, people create games for it, and there's just a huge community out there. There was a community back then. I wrote for a fan site back at the time, and people just absolutely loved the Dreamcast. They would die for it. They hate PlayStation now for killing it. But people are still there. People love the console. It's a console that still exists, and it's 25 years old, and you can still play it today and play new games on it, and talk to other people about it. So, yeah.
And not one of you said the VMU.
Oh, well.
You've got a VMU, haven't you, Casper?
I brought one as well. That was my other thing that I brought. So.
And it's crazy, because that symbolised how eccentric Sega's thinking was at the time. A memory card that was, in fact, a little tiny games console.
Yeah, I know, which is really sweet. I'd not looked at one for a while. I got it out. I was like, this is really cute. Like,
it's one of those things. Why haven't that come back? I'm afraid we're out of time. And I really enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed that too. Thank you, Keith, Casper, Angie. Please give them a big warm hand. That's it from us. Enjoy the show.
thank you.